Welcome to the Leadership Lounge, a place to kick back and listen as our experts dissect some of the biggest questions leaders face today. I'm Emma Coombe, Leadership Advisor in our London office. As a leader, identifying and developing the next generation of leadership talent isn't just important, it's critical. No decision will have a bigger impact on the performance of your business and its enduring legacy. Yet, many leaders struggle with effective succession planning, despite understanding its importance. In this episode, we're uncovering how forward-thinking leaders approach succession. Why do many succession efforts fail? How can you spot leadership potential beyond the usual suspects? What actions can you take today to transform succession planning into a cornerstone of your leadership legacy? But first, remember to share any burning questions you want our experts to answer by emailing redefiners@russellreynolds.com. It would be great to hear from you. And if you enjoy listening to our episodes, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. Let's dive in. To help us explore this critical topic, I'm joined today in the lounge by James Diggines, a leadership advisor in Russell Reynolds Associates Singapore office, who specialises in executive succession. James, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thanks, Emma. Appreciate you having me in the lounge.
So James, C-suite tenures are decreasing across industries. Our research found that CFO tenure is at a 6-year low, while CHRO tenure was just 4.4 years in 2024. With leadership transitions happening more frequently, succession planning is happening with a new sense of urgency. What first concrete steps should leaders take to build an effective leadership succession process?
I think timing is crucial. The longer the duration you have, the easier it is to start. And I think my advice would be start as soon as you are appointed in role and start thinking about it. It gives you time to assess your team and understand what you've got, and then help think about what development they may need and what your external options are. Leaving it too late is a really bad position to be in. We were called to do the CEO succession of a very well-known global financial services company 3 years ago. And the call came from the chairman to say, hey, we need to do CEO succession. And we said, when? And he said, I need to do it now. We said, what are your internal options? He said, one. And so the board at that time meant they only had the choice of who the external candidates that were available at that time, and one candidate internally. That's not a place you want to be in.
Yeah, James, that example highlights very clearly the dangers of delayed succession planning. A reasonable sized business that can afford to have really good talent would hope to have a minimum of 2, if not 3 internal options that they'd been developing over a multi-year period. And it sounds like your client didn't have that. And it really means that they lose tremendous leverage and flexibility. And our research confirms this is a widespread problem. In our board culture and director behaviour study, carried out last year with over 1,000 supervisory board level directors responding, only 29% said they had a 3 to 5 year CEO succession plan. Whilst this data point is concerning, as a firm, the great thing we are seeing is this number trending upwards. More and more boards and nomination committees are investing time and energy into identifying and developing their talent at least 3 years ahead of a succession event. James, what else do you think leaders should prioritise when beginning the succession planning process?
The other two things are roles and then alignment. I think if it's a public company, understanding what roles people are playing, and that could be the chairman, the non-co-chair, the CHRO, and the CEO, and understanding who's going to take the lead, what the cadence of the communication is going to be, and who's going to drive the process and for which role is really important. And then the last is alignment. I think good organizations that do this well have got a really clear picture on what kind of challenges the organization is facing, what kind of opportunities they're facing, and therefore what some of the implications are for leadership.
Those are excellent points, James. And of course, having clearly defined roles in succession planning is key. But for me, it's the alignment piece that is most critical. Reaching a point of alignment on what we might call a future success profile, what you want the next leader to really bring, takes considerable time and effort. For example, you might ask all of the board directors to fill out a survey, to then have an in-depth interview, and playing back where there are areas of misalignment across the key constituents allows everybody to make sure that they're focusing on the same thing moving forward. And as that pertains to strategy, and then to what the next leader should look like. Let me now bring Rebecca Slan Jerusalim into the conversation. She's a leadership advisor in RRA's Toronto office and has guided numerous organisations through the succession planning process. Rebecca, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thanks, Emma. Pleasure to be here.
Rebecca, our recent research also uncovered that only 44% of board directors feel that their company's CEO succession plan will result in an effective candidate being appointed. We know there's no universal playbook for succession and it's nuanced, but what are some of the common mistakes that leaders make when it comes to succession planning?
One common mistake I see is organizations seeing succession planning as an exercise really in replacement planning. That is, who will fall into what roles or what boxes on the org chart. It's really important to emphasize that if done well, succession really encompasses development over the long term. That means that the organization is actively identifying key talent on a regular basis and actively providing them with development opportunities and experiences that allow them to grow. Too often, succession is really a check-the-box exercise at a critical point in time, as opposed to having a long-term focus.
For me, Rebecca, that distinction is crucial. And of course, internal candidates often require a different set of experiences to make them fully credible when a succession is required. So, for example, you could have somebody who's grown up in a finance function who needs to be given responsibility leading a P&L, running a region or a business unit. Or you might have somebody who's got certain geographic experience but must have exposure to the largest region before they can be really credible. And one of my clients wasn't forward thinking enough in terms of the internal candidates. They'd identified two, and it was only 18 months ahead of the CEO stepping down that they were given exposure to a new region and actually had to very quickly get their arms around it and not really have enough time to prove themselves. I think the board found it all quite a rush, and in hindsight would have loved to think about this even 5 years in advance so that candidates had the right set of experiences and could really be compared on an equal footing when the actual succession took place. So when organisations only think about leadership talent when there is a gap, as it were, they miss the opportunity to invest in their internal talent. Coming back to you, James, what other common mistakes do you see leaders make when it comes to succession planning?
One of the things that I think some companies trip up on is they don't prioritize the key roles. If you've got a CEO, they tend to have between 8, 9 to 12 direct reports. You can't necessarily allocate the same time on succession for all of those key reports. So pick the key roles. If it's the CFO seat, which is now increasingly seen as a CEO succession seat, pick that. If it's a business role or some of the key business roles or sales roles, depending on the organization, you may want to prioritize them.
CEOs certainly need a targeted approach when they're thinking about their colleagues who have the most potential, James. And so I totally agree with you, aligning with the board, with the nominations committee on who those most likely internal successors are, and then really making sure they're tested by giving them new opportunities. Maybe it's group-wide projects if they're in a CFO role. Maybe it's mentoring and developing other leaders in the organization to test their followership. These kind of activities are so important to make sure that people can really get ahead and as I said, be ready for the moment when the succession process takes place. I'd now like to turn back to you, Rebecca. When identifying future leaders, we often gravitate towards candidates who are highly visible or remind us of ourselves. It's human nature, but this can, of course, create blind spots and missed opportunities. And Rebecca, it would be great to hear from you on how CEOs and CHROs can develop more sophisticated talent spotting skills. How can they uncover leadership potential in unexpected places across an organization?
What we really recommend is a leadership blueprint. This involves really well defining the criteria of success for that leadership role. The second piece here is really about the factors to spot talent. And when we think about the critical factors in succession, what we're really thinking about is, do they have potential to grow in role? Is there curiosity, adaptability, resilience? Do they possess social intelligence? Do they use a systems thinking approach? Are they able to kind of self-reflect and have a broader purpose? And these are really qualities that are the hallmark of who has potential to continue to evolve their leadership.
You're absolutely right, Rebecca. And often looking for these qualities can lead to surprising discoveries. In our methodology, we come up with quantitative data. Individuals fill out a suite of questionnaires that builds their leadership profile, how others experience them as a leader. And then we also have a cognitive test that develops an output on how strategic an individual is. That's combined with an in-depth interview with a search advisor and with a psychologist. The output of this is that we really do get to spot where talent lies in an organization. And recently, I was working with a client where one individual had waited for a long time for her boss to retire, and the organization had really overlooked her potential. And for us, she was just the shining star buried away with such big potential. It was incredibly exciting to spot this talent, to talk to the client about why it made sense to really invest in her as somebody for the future, and to have enough data to underpin this as well. I'd now like to introduce our final voice into the conversation, Stacey Shapiro, Leadership Advisor in our Atlanta office. Stacey, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thanks, Emma. It's great to be here.
So, Stacey, succession plans are typically developed during stable periods, but executed during times of significant disruption or transition. How do leaders ensure that their succession frameworks remain relevant and effective, even when business conditions shift dramatically?
Thanks, Emma. It's a great question right now as we see particular periods of ambiguity and uncertainty. And I think an important reminder is that role profiles are dynamic. And so thinking about annually refreshing what good looks like from a senior leader standpoint, the qualities that are likely to predict success based on the macroeconomic factors, internal factors, strategy, culture, are going to evolve across time. And so I think the other piece from a succession planning standpoint is that it's human nature to want to quickly converge on one or two top candidates, those individuals that a leader thinks are best prepared. But keeping those pipelines broad really enables an organization to be well prepared in the event that the environment shifts. We see oftentimes an organization that thinks they need a commercial leader, but because of shifts in the macroeconomic environment, they realize after 6 months or 12 months that actually what they need is a much more operationally oriented leader. And so to the extent that pipelines are robust and broad, it enables more stability across time.
I think, Stacey, you've made some great points, and organisations that are in a position to support internal succession planning, in my mind, have massively de-risked the situation. It's so hard with all the referencing in the world to make sure that an external candidate is going to land well. And so having internal options is without doubt a huge advantage. In my experience, though, what I find is that if a business has gone through a series of profit warnings, if it's been negatively impacted, even by factors outside of its control, it can be very hard for a business to allow for CEO succession with an internal candidate. Quite often, investors, a board actually want to see a fresh face, somebody from the outside, even if in the medium term it could have been better to support and back an internal candidate. So I think it's a really interesting thing for us to reflect on as leadership advisors. And sometimes maybe there's an argument to push harder to support internal candidates because they are a known entity and they understand where an organization needs to get to. A recent report by the Society for Human Resources Management found that organizations with a strong succession planning process in place have a 95% higher shareholder return compared to those without a succession plan. Rebecca, what other benefits have you observed?
Well, when succession is done effectively, it is a long-term, year-over-year approach where key talent is developed on an ongoing basis. And this ensures a number of benefits, including talent optionality. So if long-term succession planning exists, key talent is given a wide variety of development opportunities to prepare them for the next level. And done correctly, this will ensure that when a role does pop up, there is optionality about who could fill that role. The second benefit is really the retention of key players. And in offering key talent growth opportunities, the organization is really signaling to them that they are valuable and worthy of investment. And that in turn creates this kind of sense of loyalty and interest in staying in the organization. The third benefit is really about creating a culture of talent. So leaders become well versed in talking about their talent. There becomes an emphasis on long-term development planning and growth. People become comfortable giving and receiving feedback. And when succession decisions are made, it can reinforce the type of talent and broader culture the organization actually wants to cultivate. So, for example, right now I'm working with a professional services firm, and they recently replaced a longstanding leader who really espoused a siloed kind of eat what you kill mentality. And there was a lot of dysfunction in that group. And so this internal promotion really went to someone who was less well known, but who leads in a way that the organization really values. And by replacing him with this leader who espouses more of the culture and leadership characteristics that the organization is really wanting, it has really started to change the very nature of the organization's culture.
That's a really powerful example, Rebecca, and I imagine it took a huge amount of work for your client to get comfortable with appointing somebody who was less known and had a very different style, but clearly is having such a positive impact on the organisation. This shows that succession decisions are among the most powerful cultural levers available to leadership, and they signal what behaviours are truly valued, not what's just written in a mission statement. So, Stacey, not every succession candidate can be selected for a bigger role. And one of the big questions that we're often asked by our clients is how they can retain the talent that has been unsuccessful, particularly as clearly this talent has been identified as high potential, and yet they've had to be let down on their ambition to be considered for a new role higher up in the organisation. What advice do you have for our clients in this situation?
I think first and foremost, transparency around the process is critical, and making sure that individuals who are in the process feel well informed about any process that they're going to be part of, and ultimately, once a decision is made, that the candidates also have a degree of transparency into how the decision was made and certainly receive feedback, both in the context of the successful candidate and transparent feedback for the individual who is not successful. And I think a great example of this, we recently did a CEO succession for an organization. There were two internal candidates. One, of course, ultimately was successful and was named the CEO. For the individual who was not successful, what the organization did was be very clear with that individual about their development opportunities and the gaps to fill, ultimately providing an expanded role that really served to help that individual fill those gaps in terms of their experience. This had the benefit of, one, making that individual feel well informed about the process, supported in their development, and the organization retained this individual for about 2 years.
I think that's really good advice, Stacey. And frankly, it's quite likely that individuals who are not successful in such high stakes processes will leave. But the fact that your client kept somebody for 2 years is great. And hopefully one part of any candidate in a really high stakes succession process, one part of their responsibility is to think about backfilling for their own role. So hopefully an organisation has that well advanced. And if they do decide to leave, there's not such a big hole to fill. For our final question today, it can be difficult for leaders to balance developing their successors whilst continuing to lead the business and go on their own journey. How can leaders effectively balance developing potential successors while engaging in their own personal and professional development?
I think this really requires a leader to redefine what success will look like for them. It's an important mindset shift for a leader to go from a career which has really been based on their own merits, and their success has been based on what they individually have been able to accomplish. And this shift really becomes defining that success will be on the basis of what they're able to get done through a team and enabling the success of those around them. I think recognizing that in many of these situations, the CEO may be at the end of their career. They may not be moving on to another executive role. And so in those situations, it's particularly emotional. And I think there's an added degree of sensitivity that is required there.
You're absolutely right, Stacey. It's all about mindset. The most effective leaders view developing potential successors as an opportunity, not a burden. It's not a time drain. It's not a distraction from their own growth. Frankly, it allows them to do other things, hopefully better, and it forms their legacy. This is what is there after they've gone, the next generation of leaders coming through? And on this point, I'd like to close the episode with a quote from Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella on the importance of leaders being what he calls institution builders. He said, "My dad, a civil servant in India, always used to talk about institution builders as those people whose successors do better than they did themselves." I love that definition. I feel that if the next CEO of Microsoft can be even more successful than I am, then maybe I've done my job right. If the next CEO of Microsoft crashes and burns, that may result in a different verdict. This captures for me the essence of effective succession planning perfectly. It's not just about filling positions, it's about building institutions that thrive long after we've moved on. That's the real test. So, our time in the lounge today has come to an end. In 30 seconds, this is what we've learned. Start succession planning early, ideally as soon as you step into a new leadership role. View succession as an ongoing development process, not just a replacement exercise. Design a leadership blueprint where you clearly define what the criteria of success for that particular role in the future. And lastly, maintain transparency throughout the succession process to keep potential successors engaged and motivated. If you have any topics or burning questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes of Leadership Lounge, then get in touch. Email your questions to redefiners@russellreynolds.com. And if you've enjoyed listening to this episode, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. You can find us on LinkedIn and follow us on X @RRA on Leadership. You can also find us on Instagram @Redefiners Podcast, and you can now subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, goodbye.